Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is June 2nd, 2024. Now let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? So today I want to talk about the latest, obviously the news that we've had in the last few days, that the Ukrainians have been given the green light to use American weapons on Russian territory. We have more details as to what exactly the Ukrainians can use right now and what has been going on the last few days as well, especially today. So first I want to cover the news of Kursk. Why Kursk? Because we know that Kursk shares a border with Sumy, and we've talked about the fact that possibly the Russians can't launch another offensive, another type of incursion like what we saw in Kharkiv, and we've been talking about in the last few weeks. And so today there's some interesting news from pro-Russian channels indicating, now we don't have pictures, we don't have proof, but this comes directly from pro-Russian Telegram channels indicating that the Ukrainians dealt a precise blow to the head and tail of a Russian armored column, which was heading towards Sumy Oblast. And this was a large convoy, according to them, and it was a very decisive blow because the Russians obviously were not able to attack. And this is really interesting because this could have been perhaps the day that the Russians, and I believe this happened yesterday, that the Russians tried or attempted to first start this new kind of offensive in Sumy. And you see that following this decision, this really timely decision, at least, timely in the sense that thankfully was passed, but we know that if this was passed even longer ago, the Ukrainians could have dealt even more blows to the Russian military, but it's still good. And you can see that this was really well done because right after the green light was given, the Ukrainians were able to strike a large Russian convoy, which was surely heading towards Sumy and about to begin an offensive in that direction. However, we know with more details now that the United States has given the green light to use HIMARS missiles, but they forbade Ukraine from using ATACMS for now. I think it's just a matter of time. But again, you guys, if you watched my previous video, I've told you that the Biden escalation policy is, in my opinion, a disaster. It only allows aggressors to become more aggressive because you're telling the aggressor what is the American red line, and what they will never permit to do, or another country to do, like Ukraine, which only gives them more confidence to continue attacking, continue doing their operations, because they know that, well, Ukraine surely will not hit us on our territory. Thankfully, that policy has been softened, and the Ukrainians, as you can see, can hit more or less about 50 to 100 kilometers away from the Ukraine border in Russian territory. But things like ATACMS, there shouldn't be any limitations in terms of what weapons Ukraine can use, right? And I think that this is, again, another burden, another sort of barrier that Ukraine will have to cross eventually. And I think they will cross it. The United States will give the green light. But again, why can't they do it right now? That's my question. But with that aside, you can see that for this week, this is a Ukrainian picture of all the HIMARS missiles they used this week. And just based on this picture, there's over 300 of them that were used. Most of them were used in Belgorod Oblast. And as you guys have seen the last few days, it's been very hot in Belgorod, Shebekino, which we will cover in my next slide. Belgorod City and other positions within the Oblast have been struck multiple times by the Ukrainian HIMARS missiles. So it's good to see that at least Ukraine has part of this limitation removed, and they can now strike freely close to the border with Ukraine. So that is good news. You can see that this is definitely making a difference because the Russians are really alert, and they're kind of, I wouldn't say panicking, but they're very aware that the Ukrainians can now strike them in Russia, and they can't just assemble large convoys without worrying that they're going to be hit by Ukrainian or American-made ballistics or missiles. So the second picture here is from today, and this is another Ukrainian HIMARS strike in Shebekino. So this is the city that is very close to the Ukraine border, about 20-25 kilometers away, I believe. And you can see that allegedly this was a Russian military base that was struck with Ukrainian HIMARS missiles. What is interesting is, if you can see in the second picture, there seems to be an Iskander ballistic missile. That is a Russian Iskander ballistic. And surely enough, I wouldn't be surprised if this was a huge storage area for Russian ammunition, shells, and even missiles, as you can see here, and that the Russians were using Shebekino to strike Ukrainian positions, right? Kind of similar tactics like Hamas does in Palestine, in Gaza, I should say, right? So the Russians are now hiding, probably close to the city, thinking that they're very safe, dumping a bunch of ammunition and shells and missiles inside of storage area. But the Ukrainians can see everything. They have satellite imagery, and you can see that there's going to be way more of these strikes going on in Belgorod. Another good news, and you can read that here, Germany, it's just breaking news right now. Germany has officially allowed Ukraine to also shoot down Russian aircraft in the territory of Russia with Patriots that they've sent to Ukraine already. So this has been confirmed by the Major General Frederick of the Bundeswehr. And so this final decision, of course, needs to be made by the Ukraine military, which we know they will, of course, take, because this is a big problem. The Russians right now can, essentially launch these very big glide bombs, the AFB-500s, which they have thousands of, from Russian territory, and they have about a range of 60 to 70 kilometers. So they still have a lot of range once they launch them. So surely this is really positive news, and the Ukrainians will definitely take this approval, and we will be seeing more Russian jet fighters crashing not only in Ukraine but within Russian territory. And I shared with you, I believe 2 videos ago, we've talked about my frustration that last year, somewhere in May, the Ukrainians had a really big day in terms of downing Russian aircraft. I think they downed a few helicopters, an Su-34, Su-35, and allegedly Washington and Berlin, because these allegedly were donated, the Patriot missiles and air defense systems that were donated to Ukraine from Germany, and I believe from the United States as well, that were used to down these Russian aircraft. And surely enough, Washington and Berlin called Ukraine a few hours later, asking them to stop this, and if they don't, then they will they will not provide any more weaponry and assistance to Ukraine, right? Threatening Ukraine that if you continue doing this on Russian territory, we will cut you off. So that's what happened last year, and somewhere around May 2023. You can see that's a good shift. And as I've said now, it's pretty certain that Europe now understands the importance of giving the green light for Ukraine to strike Russia. And where we saw reluctance, where we saw resistance last year, mainly because, of course, the Ukrainian counteroffensive was about to happen, and the European countries and Ukrainian allies were really worried that somehow if Ukraine was really successful in this counteroffensive and downing a bunch of Russian aircraft and this and that, like this would be too much escalation. Again, the escalation management policy that Biden has put forward, and most European countries are following, right? Look at Germany. Germany is exactly copying what the United States is doing. Once the United States says yes, they say yes. So Berlin is really following Washington and many other countries in Europe as well, right? They're too afraid to be the leader. So they look up to the United States. So it's good that we have shifted this mentality that, Ukraine absolutely has the right to hit Russia. But guess why? Because for over a year, they've allowed, the Russians to do whatever they want, create their safe havens in Russia, really close to the Ukraine territory. And this pendulum swung back on Russia's side because they knew that they had advantages. They could hide. They could put men right by the border, not being worried about, getting destroyed with missiles or drones or whatever. And now, because the Ukrainians have suffered so much in the last few months, now, the West realized, oh, maybe we should allow Ukraine to hit Russia. It sucks to see that it takes a lot of pain, grief, and destruction for, countries to realize the obvious. And I'm not even discounting the fact that there's some politics behind this. It's not just, well, there's no common sense. I think there is common sense, but I think it's much higher than we understand as well when it comes down to politics here. But the good news, again, is that Ukraine can strike, and we will see a very hot summer within Russia. Kursk, Belgorod, other Russian oblasts that are very close to Ukraine will be on fire, and much, much more on fire than we're used to. So this is good news because we know the Ukrainians are strategically only striking military targets. This is going to weaken the Russian logistics. And speaking of Russian logistics, in Kharkiv, they have some serious issues right now. A lot of Russians are claiming that they lack ammunition, shells, and counter battery fire to answer back on Ukrainian strikes. So overall, this, I think, will really help and pave the way for potentially the Ukrainians by the end of the summer pushing away. Now, I'm just speculating. We don't know for sure what's going to happen, of course. But with all this pressure, I think the Russians will have to most likely leave Kharkiv Oblast by the end of the summer. But we will see. Things can change dramatically. And what we believe right now might not be true in the next few months. So one last little news is another Ukrainian strike within Soledar. So Soledar is not that far away. It's in Ukraine, in the Bakhmut area. If you guys remember, back in January of 2023, this is where the Russians did a really big offensive to take Bakhmut, and Soledar was one of the first larger cities that they took to get to Bakhmut eventually. So the Ukrainians struck a large tank repair facility in Soledar. And there is even a video on YouTube that showcases the aftermath of burning kind of depot. And surely enough, this is going to really hurt the Russians because right now they have a huge offensive in Chasiv Yar. And, of course, they're using large armored convoys full of tanks and BMPs and BTRs. And surely I believe that this facility was there to support them in repairing tanks and, adding these cope cages, of course. We've seen the Russians utilize massively cope cages, additional armor. So losing this facility will be a big blow for the Russian offensive, specifically in Chasiv Yar, where they're pushing a lot. And I think that we should be anticipating next few weeks a kind of a smaller Russian offensives in Chasiv Yar. So this is a really good strategic strike by the Ukrainians. You can see that 4 Russian soldiers died and repair companies died as well, 7 more Russians injured. So again, and it's the most important thing is that the Russians are losing a space, kind of a covered space where they can repair tanks and hide things from the Ukrainian military. But you can see that the Ukrainians surely have visibility. They have the scouts, the drones flying, and so they know where the Russians are positioned more and more as they're getting assistance, of course, from the United States. So that's the video for today, guys. Just a brief kind of overview of the last few days. Of course, I haven't covered all of the strikes that Ukraine has done on Russian territory, but you know that the Ukrainians will continue striking Belgorod, Kursk. These are the 2 most important oblasts. Of course, Rostov as well is really important, but Rostov is much further away from the Ukrainian currently controlled territories, so it's more difficult. But the Rostov Oblast is also really important for the Russians because this is, obviously where they're moving supplies from Russia to Donetsk city and then continue their pushes in Avdiivka. Let's look at the map just for a quick brief overview. But again, when we're talking about Rostov, you see this is the oblast down here, and of course the Russians are moving a bunch of supplies from Rostov, knowing that they're going to lose eventually the bridge. So this is going to be their main kind of route for resupplying, moving troops in the southern direction. In the northern direction, of course, that is Belgorod and Kursk Oblast. And Voronezh as well, but Voronezh, as you can see, is much further away from the Ukrainian controlled territory and Ukraine. So it's going to be more difficult for the Ukrainians to strike Russia with HIMARS missiles. This is where the ATACMS would have been great, especially in this direction in Luhansk. But I think for now, it's just going to be a matter of time. For now, it's not going to happen. I think the Biden administration wants to see what the response from Russia will be in the next few weeks, but I think it's going to come. So we will see more fires in Voronezh and Rostov when the Ukrainians get the green light to use ATACMS, or will eventually get Taurus missiles from Germany. I'm pretty certain that Germany will eventually budge and give Taurus missiles. So this is the situation with regards to the Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. There's going to be more of them. And in regards to the map changes, there's really not much, guys. I mean, if we're talking about some fields changing back and forth, or Russian troops getting a few fields, with regards to Kharkiv, there haven't been any changes. And as a matter of fact, I believe that in the next few weeks, the Ukrainians are shaping a counteroffensive in this direction to drive back the Russians. And they absolutely need this. Again, we'll see what really happens, but the Ukrainians need to win at least this summer. And I think this is one of the easiest ones. Drive back these Russian troops. There's not that many of them compared to what we see in Donbass right now. Look at the amount of troops that the Russians have compared to Kharkiv. So this is very doable. Drive them back, embarrass the Russians, and showcase to the Russians that the Ukrainians can defend themselves. Now, with regards to Donbass, this is more difficult. The Russians are well dug in. They have good logistics here. And so the Ukrainians here, of course, have more difficulty defending because they have so many different areas where they can hide, they can store supplies. So you can see that there's going to be a lot of pressure still in Chasiv Yar. We've talked about the Ukrainian strike in Soledar, how crucial that is with regards to this Russian offensive, because they will lack crewmen to repair tanks, repair armored vehicles, which, you know, get damaged every single day. So I think that we should be anticipating a slowdown here in Chasiv Yar in the next few weeks, but the fights are still going to be ongoing. They're still fierce, and the Russians will continue pushing as hard as they can here. But I think it's less and less likely that the Russians will be able to take Chasiv Yar, at least this year. And as a matter of fact, the Ukrainians could eventually mount a large counteroffensive to drive the Russians back, perhaps towards Bakhmut. We'll see. But so far, they haven't been able to penetrate Chasiv Yar. And same thing with Avdiivka. Avdiivka here right now, the Russians are just consolidating, as you can see, some few fields following the villages that they've taken, right? You see the kind of distance between the next villages that the Ukrainians control. So of course here I'm anticipating that the Russians will be able to take back the fields because there's no real defensible positions here. So the next set of fights will be Novopokrovske, Novoselivka, Sokil, Novoalexandrivka, all these small little villages outside of Russian-controlled villages. So this is the only way that the Ukrainians can defend themselves, because there's no real trenches or lines of defense here, unfortunately. I think they're much further away being built right now. So that's the situation with Avdiivka, but some good news. I saw a video today of Ukrainian Bradleys working, I believe, somewhere around Umanske, somewhere around this direction. I cannot tell you exactly where, but an American Bradley that was used by the Ukrainian 47th Brigade that destroyed 2 Russian BTR-82s with men that were dismounting, and they all got just massacred by this Bradley. And Ukraine, good news, is receiving a few hundred more of them, and we've seen how effective these American Bradleys have been against Russian BMPs, BTR. They just can, you know, it's like a hot knife through butter. The autocannon is just deadly. And so it's good to see that the Ukrainians have some Bradleys. They're working really hard and destroying the occupants. So there's going to be more of these great videos coming up for sure as the Ukrainians receive more and more of the Bradleys. Apart from that, south of Donetsk, more fighting around Krasnohorivka. The Russians are slowly, you know, crawling in the city center of Krasnohorivka. The Ukrainians still control the northern sector. And also you can see that kind of the entire city is a gray zone right now. So it's not confirmed who controls what. So this is another very difficult fight. And this is where the Russians are really utilizing the most of their turtle tanks, right? These tanks that they've just welded huge steel plates on. They cannot see anything. They cannot move. They've slapped a bunch of EW systems, electronic warfare systems, to you know, jam Ukraine drones. And then they just go and try to get a position within Krasnohorivka. So there's a lot of utilization of this. To a certain extent, it is useful, but then you're turning a tank into pretty much, you know, you're not seeing anything, right? So how useful is that, right? If your only goal is to just, you know, get to point A, but not get back, right? So the Russians are certainly using a lot of these, but they're also losing a lot of these BMPs and T-62s that they're just turning into like a one-way kamikaze tank almost. So apart from that, there's nothing really in terms of changes in the south, in Zaporizhia and Kherson. So I will leave you guys to it. That's pretty much the update for the last few days. I hope you enjoyed this update. Again, huge thank you for your support for this channel. Leave me a comment about any of the topics I covered today. I know there's a lot of things we covered about the Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory, the potential for, you know, pushing the Russians out of Kharkiv by the end of this summer, and some other things that I commented. So a huge thank you again. Leave me a comment, leave me a like, subscribe to my channel if you enjoy my content, and I will see you guys in the next one. Slava Ukraini!